Welcome back to Outdoors Type. In this video I'm going to delve into the short history of a struggling little railway line from Glenelg to Marino that only lasted about a year and resulted in the deaths of 3 people. The Glenelg and South Coast Tramway Company line ran south from the junction of Moseley Street and Jetty Road along Moseley Street until it turned west where Tarlton Street is now and into and along Phillipps Street. It then curved south to enter the dunes until it reached a level just above the high tide mark and proceeded to Marino from there. In the mid-1870s, Brighton and surrounds were starting to become a popular place to live, but back then it was still isolated from Glenelg and Adelaide by sand and the floodplains of the Sturt River. Some people walked, some used horses, but the trip was often a gruelling one made by skirting the floodplain via higher country to Goodwood. The South Australian Company began quarrying for bluestone and gypsum nearby in the 1840s, and George Strickland Kingston opened his own quarry at Marino in 1844. There were virtually no roads back then, so the stone was hauled by bullocks and the drivers had to find their own way to Adelaide, which was next to impossible in winter. A small pier was built at Marino Rocks, but this was still uneconomical. Inspired by the Glenelg to Adelaide line in 1873, Sir George came up with the idea of installing a railway line from Marino to Glenelg for his stone and passengers. He and fellow promoters and investors overcame more than a few hurdles in the planning and financing of their proposed line, which unfortunately resulted in the disastrous outcome of the railway basically running along the beach. Had the line run further inland as originally planned, it may have succeeded. Construction commenced in 1878 and was completed in a few months. There was no ballast, the street lines were embedded in the road, and the rest was laid on sand. The Marino Company had to borrow locos and rolling stock from the Glenelg Railway to begin with so they could start making money. Eventually, 2 locomotives and a Rowan double-deck steam railcar operated on the line. If you're wondering why this odd street formation is here, it might be because this was the location of the depot and workshops for the Marino line, with shunting loops for the single line. Operations on the line were beset with problems from the very beginning. Sand drifting across the line caused delays and had to be removed manually, right from opening day in 1879. As the erosion caused by the line progressed, the sand drifts grew worse, and wind-blown sand caused extensive damage to the rolling stock. After the excitement of its first summer opening had abated and people realised that they only had to travel to Glenelg and not pay to go further to enjoy the beach, passenger numbers declined and were virtually non-existent in winter. Further setbacks to the transport of quarry products were dealt when the proposed storage site on Jetty Road was vetoed by the council, who had also ordered the removal of the junction between the Marino line and the Adelaide line. The first fatal accident occurred on Easter when 2 children travelling on the step of the crowded train missed their intended destination and jumped off the train. They fell under the wheels and were killed. Witnesses were unable to get the crew's attention and the train carried on. Finally, after a brief summer resurgence in early 1880, another fatal accident sealed the line's fate. A locomotive became derailed by the sand yet again and toppled, crushing a passenger who was riding on the engine. The line drew plenty of criticism for its lax standards, and the reduced patronage made the line completely unprofitable. The company ceased operations in 1880 and its assets sold off around the state. It's hard to imagine how they considered this railway would go when the line ran generally about a foot above the high water mark. They didn't think of sand drift or storms or any of that stuff, and of course they came unstuck. Well folks, that's the short story of one of the most remarkable, unique and ill-conceived railways in Australia. Had it have been built inland, or perhaps a decade or so later, it may have succeeded. The horse-drawn tram lines reached Brighton Marino a few years later, and the South Australian Railways built a line to Marino in 1914. Thanks for joining me on this little trip. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then give me a thumbs up and subscribe. There's heaps more to come, and I'll see you then.